Okay. Well, good evening. We're getting on into the final section of the book of Genesis here this evening, getting in specifically to Genesis 37 through 50. Now, this particular account sets the stage for the Exodus and for the covenant that God made with Israel. And that this material really in Genesis comes up to and culminates with the covenant relationship that God entered into with the descendants of Abraham. God had made a covenant with Abraham centuries earlier and had made promises to Abraham concerning his descendants. Now, the story, the stage is being set for the book of Exodus, and in so doing, what we find is the way that Israel came down into the land of Egypt and grew into a great nation. Next Bible study, I will pass out a chronology that will give you that will lay it out and correlate the story of the Bible with the dynasties of Egypt, and you can have a connection of secular history with biblical history, as well as sort of seeing the dates and things as they go through. Some of those dates you could maybe quibble about 1 or 2 years one way or the other, but I think that when we're talking about 3,500 years ago, and if we can get within 5 years, we're pretty close. So I think the dates are basically accurate, but I wouldn't stake my salvation on them, and I hope you wouldn't stake yours. But anyway, we find the story. There's an interesting story in terms, when you look at the correlation of secular history. Egypt was ruled over by many dynasties, and some of these dynasties were native to Egypt and others were foreign dynasties. And what we find is that just prior to the time when Joseph came into the land of Egypt, a foreign dynasty had taken power in Egypt. It is known by the term shepherd kings in history, or Hyksos is the other name. Shepherd kings is more the English term. But the Hyksos, or the shepherd kings, were people who were basically the same stock as the family of Abraham. They had originated, they're called Asiatics in Egyptian history. They had originated in Mesopotamia, had invaded Egypt, had gained control of the Nile Delta at the time when Joseph came into the land of Egypt. Under Joseph and the years of plenty and famine, the Hyksos spread their rulership out over all of Egypt. It was this dynasty under which Joseph rose to power, and it gives meaning to the statement at the beginning of Exodus that there arose a king who knew not Joseph. A new dynasty, an Ethiopian dynasty, expelled the Hyksos, and that was the beginning of the end in terms of Israel, because that's when the enslavement of Israel began, when the Hyksos were expelled. The Israelites were viewed as this had been an alliance with them. In fact, we'll notice an interesting statement as we go through the book of Genesis when Joseph, in talking to his father, as his father was getting to go before Pharaoh, encouraged his father to lay stress on the fact that he was a shepherd when he went there. And he said, now shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. They weren't, of course, to the Hyksos. The Hyksos were the shepherd kings. And so what they did was to give a very choice piece of land to the land of Goshen, some of the most choice land they gave to Jacob and his family, because they were, oh, you're a shepherd too, huh? You go in for that. Well, these Egyptians, they don't like that. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to give you some good land. You sound like our kind of folks. That was the setup. So it provides the backdrop. There's also a very important prophetic chapter, and that is chapter 49. 48 and 49 that contain some important prophetic information regarding the family of Jacob, the family of Israel. It's interesting, as we will note as we get to Genesis 49, that Jacob he told his sons to come near. He would show them what would happen to them in the last days. Now, that section, those verses, of and by themselves, ought to clearly demonstrate that the tribes of Israel are separate, identifiable units at the end time. They've not all been absorbed as the Jews. Otherwise, how could you have a separate prophecy for each one of these sons? And they were told, this is in the last days. This is what shall befall you. So that's just one among many prophecies that are made plain, or that make plain some things about the identity of Israel. Also, of course, chapter 48 gives a further development, a final development in the book of Genesis to the promises made to Abraham. You know, the promises we saw last Bible study continued to expand out. Abraham was promised that he would be made a great nation. First God says, go to a land that I'll show you. And then God told him what the land was. And he said, I'll make of you a great nation. Then a little later he says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to make of you a father of many nations. Then he told him that that a company of nations shall come out of you. And you'll be a father of kings. And your descendants will possess the gates of their enemies. And the prophecies kept being expanded and expanded. Now we find in Genesis 48 that the birthright promise is not only given to Joseph, but specifically to Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, and that Manasseh is to become a great nation, and Ephraim is to become a great company of nations. And that is expanded out in the book of Genesis, that this unfolding of the birthright promise. Now, let's pick up the story in chapter 37. You know, there are incidental things that we can learn as we proceed on along through the story, just points that come out. Last time we looked a little bit. There's some lessons of child rearing that we can learn as we look at the story of Lot, even as we look at the story of Jacob and his daughter Dinah, and some of the liberties he allowed her by allowing her to sort of run with the locals. She got into trouble. That should not have been a great shock, because people tend to be heavily influenced by the crowd they run with, and you know, there are lessons on various levels that we can draw from every section of the Bible, and particularly these accounts. Though the main emphasis of the account may be something else, there are many times just practical lessons of life that we can learn as we look at it. Now, in Genesis, early on in Genesis 37, we learn a little bit more about a mistake that Jacob made in terms of his child rearing. There was a mistake on his part that certainly led to serious resentment that Joseph's brothers had toward him. And when you read in Genesis 37, verse 3, that we learn that Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Now, okay, you can understand that. This was the son of his favorite wife, which again, we find that there were problems introduced into the family because you had children of different women that were all there under the same roof, and so there were certain rivalries and difficulties. But Joseph was his favorite. All right? And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, guess what? They hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. You see, Jacob made the mistake of showing his favoritism. Joseph was his favorite. And as a little time went by, it became obvious to all the others that Joseph was his favorite. And guess what? They resented Joseph all the more. So, again, we can look at that and just on a level of child rearing realize that to openly show favoritism in a family is to risk creating the same kind of rift that came to exist here in Jacob's family. It just fed the problems. Jacob openly showed this favoritism, and the brothers of Joseph just hated him. Now, Joseph compounded his problem. Joseph, you sort of get the idea. Joseph was young. He was 17, and he was not. There evidently was not a deceitful bone in Joseph's body. He just tended to just come out with whatever popped in. Well, he dreamed a dream. Okay, that's fine. He told it to his brethren. That was not necessarily the wisest course of action. As Ecclesiastes says, there's a time to speak and a time to keep silent. There are things that it's simply better not to say. You don't have to tell everyone everything that you know or every thought that has run through your mind. Well, Joseph had a dream, and he was all excited, and he says, guess what? I had a dream last night, and we were all in the field binding sheaves. And you know what? The sheaf that I bound stood up, and your sheaves all stood up around it, and your sheaves all bowed down to my sheaf. Now, don't you know his brothers just loved that dream? Oh, his brothers said in verse 8, are you indeed going to reign over us? Are you going to have dominion? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his word. Boy, they just resented that. And he dreamed another dream. He didn't get the hint the first time around. And so he dreamed another dream. And in this dream, he saw the sun, the moon, and he saw the sun, the moon, and 12 stars. And which is symbolic of the family of Israel. You find that symbolism, by the way, used back in Revelation 12 when it describes the woman, which was the Old Testament church Israel and the New Testament church of God. Well, in the dream, he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 of the stars all bow down to him. Well, he went around telling this dream, and everybody was upset about it. And they said, well, that doesn't make... We're not going to all bow down to you. Verse 11, his brethren envied him. But his father observed the saying. His father first got a little upset about it, and then he got thinking about it, and he thought, there may be something to this. Jacob had a few dreams in his life, and as he began to think about it, it sounded sort of strange, but he just, decided, well, he would see what happened. But his brethren just resented him all the more. They just, it was like their resentment kept growing. Well, the brothers went off to feed their father's flock down in Shechem, and Jacob told Joseph, he said, I want you to go down there and check on your brothers and see what they're up to. Come back and tell me. Now, the brothers loved this. I suspect Jacob may have sent Joseph to check up on them more than once. And, there were probably some things that, they were doing that they weren't necessarily wanting their dad to hear about. And you know how people always resent the guy that's going to go back and, tell dad or tell the teacher or whatever it is. So Joseph went on down and eventually found his brothers. They saw him afar off, verse 18, and they had been building up so much resentment. There were some of them really ready to kill him. Simeon particularly, who had sort of a hot temper, as we've already seen in the story of Shechem. So they said to one another, verse 19, behold, this dreamer comes. And they said, let's just kill him. Let's get rid of him. Reuben, verse 21, Reuben was the oldest, and he felt responsible, and he said, no, let's not do that. And he had in mind, he said, we'll just put him in the pit, and he had in mind to get him out and get him back to his father. Well, they took Joseph's coat, threw him in the pit, and sat down to eat, verse 25. And when they looked, they saw in the distance, they saw this caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites, merchants on their way to Egypt. And Judah, verse 26, said, what profit is it if we slay him and conceal his blood? Let's sell him. I think it's sort of interesting. Judah started counting up the profit on the thing and said, there's no money in this killing business. If we sell him, we can make some money off this deal. You guys thought about that? Let's sell him. Let's make a little bit. So anyway, we see that this struck them as a pretty good idea. When Reuben got back, he found out that they'd sold Joseph, sold him down to Egypt, and they perpetrated this sort of a fraud on their father. They took Joseph's coat and tore it and dipped it in blood and took it back to him and gave him the impression that Joseph had probably been killed by wild animals. So anyway, that was sort of the story, and Joseph is now down in Egypt, 17 years of age, uprooted from his family, horribly traumatic thing to go through. And he is taken down in Egypt and he's sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Now, chapter 38 gives us a little bit of an insight, and it is significant in the long-term prophetic implications, because we learn the story, the origin of two sons of Judah that were born as twins, Pharez and Zerah, and the story of the scarlet thread. I would refer you back, I think Mr. Armstrong's book on U.S. and Britain and prophecy has a section, one of the editions of it has a section on the story of the scarlet thread. But what we find is, of course, that Judah had two sons by Tamar, and there were twins actually. And what appeared to be, as these twins were struggling, a little arm began to come out, and the midwife that was there quickly took a scarlet thread and wrapped it around the wrist with the idea of being able to identify which was which, who was the firstborn, which was very significant. Well, in the course of this, in the course of the labor, the one whose little wrist had stuck out and got the scarlet thread wrapped around it withdrew back in the womb, and the other brother was actually born first. And so this created, as it's called here, a breach. It was here one had started to come out first, had actually begun the birth process and was first out, and yet was not first fully out. And so the one with the scarlet thread actually came out, was the second one. And so what we find, the Zerah was the one with the scarlet thread, and Pharez was the one who broke forth first. Now, what you find historically is that King David and the Davidic line came down from Pharez, but the Zerah also had a royal line that came down, the kings of Ireland, and you find to this day the seal of Ulster is the red hand with the thread wrapped around it there at the there at the wrist. And this the breach in that sense was healed when Tehatefi, who was the daughter of Zedekiah, last king of Judah, the Davidic line, was married to Hermon, king of Ireland, and the present royal family in Britain is descended from that union. Tara was the ancient seat of the high kings of Ireland, and the stone of, as it's called now, the stone of Scone, Jacob's pillar stone, the stone of destiny, various terms that have been used for it, was initially taken from Jerusalem to Tara. The high kings of Ireland were crowned upon it until a number of centuries later, when, as Kenneth MacAlpin of Scotland, the dynasty of Tara actually transferred to Scotland. And when you study the story, you find that the people called the Milesian Scots actually initially settled portions of Ireland, moved on to Scotland, and then many of them were later reintroduced back into Northern Ireland and what is called Ulster. And anyway, the line coming on down through the stone was moved in, I believe, the 9th century A.D. Was moved to from Tara in Ireland to Scone in Scotland, and the kings of Scotland, beginning with Kenneth MacAlpin in the 800s, were crowned on that stone, and then later King Edward I moved it down from Scone down to England, and the kings have been crowned on that since that time. Now, the background of some of that is given here in Genesis 38, an interesting story, because Judah had sons, and he had a daughter-in-law by the name of Tamar. And we find that two of his sons died, and Judah had promised to take care of Tamar, but did not do that. Well, when Tamar saw that when Tamar saw that Judah wasn't going to follow through with what he promised, she put together a little ruse. She arrayed herself in the attire of a harlot, and she was veiled, and there on the side of the road, and Judah was on his way to shear his sheep, and he saw her, and he decided that he would invite her over to his tent, and so he propositioned her, and then told her that he didn't have any money with him right then, but he would send her. Told her what he would send her, and she said, "Well, look," she said, "I want a pledge. You give me your signet and your bracelets. You give me some of these items, and I know you'll redeem it. You'll do that." So he did. Well, a little while later, when he sent back to pay her, well, nobody knew who this harlot was, and so time went on. Well, then word gets to Judah that his daughter-in-law is pregnant. And is he upset. He can't believe immorality in his own household. He is very upset. In fact, he's going to have her burnt. The end of verse 24. And, this must have been quite a scene. She came in, and he was really laying in, and he bring her forth and let her be burnt. And she said, okay, but I think you probably want to do something to the man that was involved here. Maybe you know who these belong to. And you can just imagine, there in the room, the look that must have come over his face when he looked at that stuff. And he was caught. I mean, that was his signet ring. That was the whole thing. And he knew, and everybody there knew who this was. And so, verse 26, at least he acknowledged them, admitted it, and said, "She's been more righteous than I have." So he knew her again no more. He evidently learned some sort of a lesson from that. And it came to pass that she had these twins, Pharez and Zerah. One interesting thing, I just call your attention sometime when you go through the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, you realize there are only 4 women who are named by name in the genealogy in Matthew. Each one of them has sort of an interesting story. It doesn't mention Sarah or Rebecca or Leah by name in Matthew 4. Those are mentioned back in Genesis. But it mentions 4 women. It mentions Rahab and Ruth and Tamar and Bathsheba. Sort of interesting when you get to looking into it and look at that. I won't comment on the significance of that, but eventually when we get to Matthew, we will deal with that. But you can take note of it. Well, now we get back to the main line of the story here in chapter 39. And as Joseph was here in Egypt, God blessed Joseph. Joseph was a very conscientious, very sincere young man, very honest, very capable, a young man of very high standards. And Potiphar, within a short time, realized that Joseph was an outstanding young man, that he could absolutely trust him. And, that's a rare thing. Any of you who've ever had an employee know if you get one you can absolutely trust, and he's capable, all at the same time, you have really got a jewel. Sometimes they're capable, but you can't trust them. Sometimes you can trust them, but they can't do anything right. But when you get the combination, and that's what Joseph was, and Potiphar picked up on that. And so fairly soon, even though Joseph was young, he set him over as the overseer over his house. Knew he could absolutely depend on him. Well, things went on, and Joseph did an outstanding job, and Potiphar's affairs prospered. You sort of makes you wonder what the previous guy had been skimming off the top. Potiphar noticed a very distinct difference when he put Joseph in charge. Joseph wasn't stealing anything. He was very conscientious and did a good job. Well, the story marches on. Now this time, Potiphar's wife, Mrs. Potiphar, was not of very high character, and she was enamored with Joseph and decided that she would seduce him. But you see, Joseph wouldn't be seduced. Joseph knew that was wrong, and Joseph was a young man who was very much aware of God and God's ways and God's laws. And so Joseph told her when she had tried to get him to commit adultery with her, in verse 8 of chapter 39, Joseph said, "Behold, my master's committed everything to my hand. He's not kept back anything but you." Verse 9. Notice the end of verse 9. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now you might stop and think that for those who think that the Ten Commandments didn't come along until Mount Sinai, Joseph knew that it was a sin against God. Knew that adultery was a sin. Now what is sin? Sin's the transgression of the law. So God's law was already in force and effect. Joseph knew God's law. I mean, you can read back that God says Abraham obeyed my voice. He kept my commandments, my statutes, and my charge. Abraham knew what the commandments were. Joseph knew what they were. He knew adultery was a sin, and he said, "I can't do this. If I did, this would be wicked, and it would be a sin against God." And that ultimately is who all sin is against. See, Joseph didn't say, "I'd be sinning against Potiphar." I mean, it would be a wicked thing to do and a breach of Potiphar's trust, but ultimately it would be a sin against God. Well, she, tried to proposition him a few more times, finally got mad. See, when he rejected her, then all of a sudden it went to the other end. Now she was rejected. Joseph had fled out of the room to get out of that situation, and she was furious. And so she began to scream and carry on and accused him of rape or attempted rape, and told this story to Potiphar. I have to believe that Potiphar must have had at least some doubt in his mind about what she said. He wasn't prepared to put her away, but he had some doubt in his mind because, when you read the history of ancient Egypt, human life was cheap. And to have had a slave executed for attempted rape would have been nothing. I mean, here was a man who was the commander of Pharaoh's army. Nobody would have objected if he just said, run this fellow through with a spear. He put him in jail, and that was it. So I have to believe that Potiphar had at least some level of doubt in his mind whether he wanted to fully face up to the kind of person Mrs. Potiphar was or not. He had enough doubt in his mind that he didn't execute him. He just put him in prison. Well, as the story goes on, we find that Joseph now is in prison, and Joseph remains in prison until he's 30 years of age. As we come on back to the end of the story, we find that Joseph stood before Pharaoh when he was 30 years of age, and that's down in Genesis 41:46. So Joseph was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh, which means that from the time he was 17 until the time he was 30, that's 13 years. And that's right out of the heart and prime of a young man's life. You take those years from 17 to 30. Time doesn't go very fast during that period of time. Here was Joseph. we read the story, and it only takes up 2 or 3 chapters, and we go through it quickly, and we know the outcome. But Joseph went through his trials and his problems the same way you and I go through ours. He hadn't read the book of Genesis yet. He didn't know how many years and exactly what was going to happen. Here he was trying to be the obedient son, trying to do what he was supposed to do. He was the good kid. And so he gets uprooted from his family and sold into slavery. Well, that's bad. Well, he gets down there and things begin to work fairly well, and he gets favor, and Potiphar gives him a lot of freedom, and so, things aren't so bad. He goes along and he's feeling pretty good, and things are going fairly well, and seems like life is beginning to get on some sort of a keel. He then is tempted. Now, here's a young man, in his late teens, 18, 19, 20 years old. Here's quite a temptation that, one of the strongest drives and pulls that a young man has. And here he, is given opportunity and over and over. And he's enticed. And yet he exercises strong character. He does what he knows is right. He refuses to give in to the temptation. And so, does he instantly get blessed and wonderful things start happening? No. He gets falsely accused, falsely imprisoned, shipped off to jail. Now, I don't know exactly what an Egyptian jail was like, but jails today aren't very good. And I have to believe that Egyptian jails of, over 3,500 years ago were a whole lot worse. So here he is thrown in this horrible situation. And, you think about how it must have gone. He must have played things back in his mind and wondered why. If you've done something terrible and then something bad happens, it sort of makes sense to you. If he had committed adultery, if he had given in and then been thrown in jail, he could have stood there and, boy, I sure blew it. I made a terrible mistake. Now look what's happened. But he did what was right. And he was thrown in jail. Now, that doesn't go easily with any of us when you're trying to do what's right and then things blow up in your face. Joseph could have become embittered. He could have become a lot of things. You see, what we find is that God had great plans for Joseph, but He tried and tested him before those plans began to come to fruition. Joseph had obviously lessons to learn, maturing to do, and God wanted to try him and test him. You see, it's one thing to obey for the good times. But if God is real to us and we're really deeply convinced in our heart and mind, then good times or bad times, we're still doing what God says because we believe it. And we believe that God means what He says. And there's an important lesson there because sometimes we find ourselves in things where we have tried to do what was right and then it's like things blow up in your face. And that's what happened to Joseph. And then, of course, we want to make sense out of things. So Joseph is in jail for a little while. And, he was given favor in the eyes of the prison keeper. And was pretty well given the run of the jail, but he was still in jail. And then the butler and the baker of Pharaoh were thrown in jail. And they had dreams. And Joseph talked to them one day, and they were, feeling bad. They had these dreams. And Joseph said, interpretations belong to God. Verse 8, if you'll tell me your dreams, I think God will give me the understanding of what they mean. Well, the butler told Joseph his dream, and Joseph told him the interpretation. Down in verses 12 and 13 was that you're going to be given back in 3 days. You're going to be given your old job back. And when you get it back, please remember me and tell Pharaoh about my story. Maybe he'll show mercy to me and let me out. And so he told him, and the baker, of course, the the butler, "Oh, yes, boy, you know, that's wonderful. And I'm going to get out in 3 days. Boy, that's great. Yeah, I'll sure tell Pharaoh." Well, the baker, you know, he began to sort of look up about that time. And he thought, well, this interpretation was pretty good. So he told Joseph his dream. Joseph said, "Yours isn't so good. 3 days, you're going to get something too. But what you're going to get is executed." And so, sure enough, verse 20, the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. Interesting, the only two specific mentions of birthdays in the Bible, here and back in Matthew, where we learn about, or in the Gospels, when we learn about Herod's birthday. You don't read anything about Christ's birthday. You know, God didn't even tell us which day it was. Obviously, God dates many events. If He had wanted Christ's birthday celebrated, then He would have certainly told us when it was. You'd read about, you know, Peter and James and John, all of them getting together and having a party or setting up a Christmas tree or whatever it was. Well, they didn't do any of those things. But anyway, Pharaoh had a birthday, and he beheaded the baker and freed the butler. Well, the butler was restored, verse 21, to his old job. And verse 23, the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, you know, here is again a lesson. You know, Joseph, don't you know he must have had high hopes? I mean, here 3 days later, this thing was fulfilled. The butler went back. You can just imagine, you know, last thing butler said, "Boy, I'm sure going to remember you. This is great. You know, I'm so happy I'm getting out of here. Yeah, now don't forget me. Oh, no, I won't forget you." Well, he forgot. He got back, and he was all happy to have his old job. And the last thing he wanted to think about was jail. And didn't even cross his mind. He didn't think about it again. Well, at the end of 2 full years. I mean, here's all his time going by. Now, you know, 2 years have gone by. You can just imagine, you know, the first day or two after the butler was free, Joseph must have been just on pins and needles. He just was watching the door, just knew any minute somebody's going to come and send for me. A day went by, a week went by, a month went by, and you can just imagine, you know, how just sort of disappointed and heartsick he must have been, because he just knew this is the way God's going to deliver me. I mean, just it all fits. You ever try to second guess God? I mean, it's just obvious. This is the way God's working it out. And then it doesn't happen that way. And you just, oh, no. Well, Joseph went through that, and he went through it for 2 years. And then Pharaoh had a dream. And his was an odd dream. He saw 7 big fat cows eating in a meadow, and 7 skinny cows coming up out of the river. And I mean, they were really skinny. And they came up, and here these skinny cows ate up the fat cows. Now, you don't generally see a cow eating another cow, but these skinny cows ate the fat cows, but they didn't get any fatter for it. They were just as skinny as ever. And Pharaoh woke up. Boy, he couldn't figure out what that was. And then he had another similar dream about ears of corn, ears of grain. And he was troubled in verse 8, called for the magicians, the wise men. Nobody could explain his dream. And then the butler was standing there, and he said, "Oh, no. There was something I was supposed to tell you 2 years ago. I just slipped my mind. You know, you remember back when you threw me in jail, there's a guy I met in jail, and he interpreted my dream. I had a dream, and he interpreted it, and it came to pass. And the baker, he had a dream, and he interpreted that, and just came just exactly." Well, Pharaoh sent for Joseph and brought him hastily out of the dungeon. So Joseph cleaned up, he shaved and changed his clothes and came into Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, "I've had a dream, nobody can interpret it. Can you do it?" And Joseph told him, verse 16, "It's not in me. God shall give you an answer of peace." You know, Joseph didn't take the credit. He said, this comes from, it'll be that God will give it to you. Well, Pharaoh told Joseph the dream, and Joseph then explained the interpretation and said, there are going to be 7 plentiful years of harvest. You're going to have 7 wonderful years here over the next 7 years in Egypt, but at the end of that 7 years of good, they're going to be succeeded by 7 bad years. 7 years of famine. And there's going to be drought, and there's going to be serious problems. And he said, my advice is that you find you someone that you can trust, that's wise and discreet, somebody you can count on, and set him over the land and get things organized so that you save up from the 7 good years so that you're able to go through the 7 bad years without any real problem. Pharaoh thought that sounded like a good idea, and he said, well, talk to his servants. He said, where are we going to find somebody that we can put over something like this? He said, this Joseph, this fellow that they brought up here, he explained what the dream is. And I don't know of anybody better than him. He figured out something that nobody else figured out. Let's put him in charge. So he told Joseph, you'll be over my house. According to your word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Here is Joseph, literally from rags to riches overnight. He goes from jail to being number 2 man in Egypt. An incredible story. But you see, Joseph didn't know that was what was going to happen. He didn't know that that was the way the story was going to work out. All these things kept going wrong. See, Joseph had 13 years. He could have gotten bitter. He could have done a lot of different things. But God tried and tested him and saw that Joseph could be counted on. And God has in mind to entrust us with something far greater than simply being in charge of Egypt for a few years. And so if Joseph had to be tried and tested for that job, certainly God has to try and test us. Well, Joseph was 30, we're told in verse 46, and he began to wisely administer the land. Well, as the story goes on, we find, of course, that now we come back to the rest of the family, Jacob's family, because you see the famine reached into the land of Canaan. And Egypt was the only place where you could buy grain. By the way, sort of an interesting little story. If you look on a map, Memphis, Tennessee is quite a notable place right there on the Mississippi River, and up above Memphis, if you go on up not too many miles, you come to a place called Cairo, Illinois. And if you look carefully at a map, you'll find there are 2 or 3 other cities that there's down near Cairo is a place called Thebes, Illinois. And that whole little section there of southern Illinois, as you come down, the Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee sort of come very close together there along the Mississippi. That's called, that area was known as Little Egypt, going way back to the 1800s when there was a time of drought and a time of crop failures, and those were that little section was the area that had plenty, and so as it began to be settled and towns, they actually took the names of various of the cities of Egypt, and that area to this day is known as Little Egypt. Sort of interesting sometimes how those things come down, but in Egypt it's Cairo, but in Illinois it's Cairo. Spelled the same though. If you go there and if you ask directions to Cairo, Illinois, they know you ain't from around there. As Joseph's brothers, his 10 brothers, came to Egypt to buy corn, and Jacob wouldn't let Benjamin come. Benjamin was the youngest, and he was the apple of Jacob's eye. He wouldn't let him come. Well, Joseph was the governor, and he recognized the brothers. But, of course, the brothers didn't recognize him. The last guy that they expected to be dealing with as governor of Egypt was their brother that they had sold into slavery. And so here he is, dressed in royal garb and standing up there. And there's no way, they never even thought about that being Joseph. Well, Joseph knew the brothers, and he remembered the dreams. It's interesting. You see, they came up there. Well, what did they do? Joseph was the governor. We're told in verse 6. They came and they bowed themselves. Bowed down, just like had been in the dream. And Joseph, it clicked in his mind. He recognized them. Here they were, their sheaves were bowing down to his sheaf, but they didn't realize it was Joseph. Well, Joseph began to, sort of test them out a little bit. And they accused them of being spies, and they said, oh, no, we're come to buy food. And they told him who they were and told him a little bit about their situation. And Joseph said, I don't believe you. I want you to bring your youngest brother back here. You say, there are 11 of you that are still alive. You've got a younger brother. Well, you bring him. And so... Anyway, Joseph, the story goes on, and they were actually locked up for 3 days, verse 17. And verse 19, he says, if you be true men, let one of your brethren be bound in the house of your prison, and the rest of you go carry the corn for the famine to your house, and bring your youngest brother to me. Then your words will be verified, and you will not die. And they got to talking one to another, and they said, we're guilty concerning our brother. We wouldn't listen, and we just ignored his pleas. And, they began to talk among themselves. And Reuben says, I told you so, verse 22, which certainly endeared him to the rest of them. We always like to hear that from somebody. And they didn't know that Joseph understood them, see, because he'd been using an interpreter speaking Egyptian. But anyway, he came back and he took Simeon and had Simeon bound, and they left. Well, when they got back, when they opened the sacks of grain, they found out their money. He's just gonna know that we somehow tricked him or stole it. We're in serious trouble. Well, they came to Jacob, told him what had happened, and anyway, Jacob told them, look, he says, I'm losing my children. Joseph is not, Simeon is not. Now you're going to take Benjamin away? I'm not going to let you go. Well, famine got worse, and finally they had eaten up the grain, and Judah reminded his dad, Jacob told him to go back and buy some more, and Judah told him in verse 3, he said, look, he told us that he's not going to let us in if we don't bring our youngest brother back. So they talked about it. Jacob didn't want to let him go, but finally he could see there was no other way, so he did. And they came back and brought double money in, verse 15. And Joseph was going to have a banquet given. And so the story comes on through, and Joseph speaks to them. We have the story here beginning in verse 26, and they talk about their dad. And so anyway, they came and sit down to eat, and Benjamin was given the extra, the best food, and everything was, really loaded up with him. Well, again, in chapter 44, Joseph was going to test them a little more. He had the money put back in there, and he had the silver cup. He had his own silver cup that he used at the banquet put in Benjamin's sack. And he sent them off, and they didn't know it. And a little while later, he sent his servants after them to chase them down and get them. And when they got there, they opened up the sacks, found the money, and they found his cups. He said, somebody's stolen my master's cup. So they brought them all back. And, the brothers denied, you see, that they had stolen anything. And they said, look, we don't have it. None of us stole the cup. If you find the cup in one of our sacks, well, whoever you find it, let him die. And we'll be bondsmen. They were absolutely confident. Well, they brought them back, opened the sacks, verse 11. Verse 12, when they got to Benjamin's sack, they found the cup. Well, Judah and his brethren, verse 14, came to Joseph's house. And Joseph said, what have you done? And Judah begins to go through, and he tells him the story, and he says, look, as you come on down for it, he says in verse 33, now therefore I pray you, let your servant abide instead of the lad, a bondsman to my Lord. And he said, let me take his place. Now you know what begins to happen, you see, as Joseph begins to test his brothers to see what kind of attitudes they have. Do they still have that sort of cruel, vindictive attitude? Do they have this resentment toward Benjamin that they had toward him? You know, have they learned anything in these 20 years? Well, you know, what he begins to see is a different attitude, because they have, over this time, they have realized a little bit of what they've done. They've seen what it did to their dad. And now, some of the ones that took the lead in trying to get rid of Joseph, they've changed. Judah now, instead of trying to cut a deal and make some profit, says, I'll take his place. Let him go. I'll stand for whatever. Well, Joseph at this point makes himself known to his brothers. They are absolutely shocked and just couldn't believe what had transpired. So they go back to get Jacob. And they tell Jacob in verse 26, Joseph is yet alive. He's governor over all Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted. He couldn't believe him. He just passed out. And so they told him, let's all go down. And so Jacob said, Joseph, my son, is yet alive. Verse 28, I'll go and see him before I die. So they took their journey, and God appeared here to Jacob and told him in verse 3 of chapter 46, I am God, the God of your father. Don't fear to go down to Egypt. I'll make of you a great nation. I'll go down with you into Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again. And Jacob put his hand upon, and Joseph shall put his hand upon your eyes. And Jacob arose, and they went down into Egypt. And goes through those that came in and gives a list. And we find that when they came in, in verse 26, all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 66. And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2. And so all the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. And so he sent Judah before him, and Joseph made ready. And he told his father in verse 31, I'm going to send unto his brethren to his father's house. I'll go up and show Pharaoh. And verse 33, it'll come to pass, Pharaoh shall call you and shall say, what is your occupation? And say, your servant's trade has been cattle from our youth even until now, we and our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So Joseph told Pharaoh that his father was come, and he brought them and introduced them, and Jacob told him in verse 3, your servants are shepherds, we and our fathers, and to sojourn in the land we're come. So Pharaoh told Joseph, In verse 6, the land of Egypt is before you. In the best of the land make your father and your brethren to dwell, the land of Goshen. And make them rulers over my cattle. Let them watch over my herds and flocks. And Jacob, we're told at this point in verse 9, is 130. Pharaoh asks him how old he is, and he tells him that he's 130. And so we know that Joseph by this time is 39. He was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh. You had 7 years of plenty, and this was the second year of the famine. So that would be 9 years since his release. That would make him 39. You see that Joseph truly was the son of his father's old age, because if he was 39, his father was 130. That means that Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. So anyway, give you a little bit of the chronology of it. They came on into the land of Egypt, and we have the rest of that story, the land of Goshen. Now in Jacob, verse 28, lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and he was 147, and he was wanted to be taken back and buried in the promised land in the tomb that Abraham had bought to bury Sarah in. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah were all buried there in that cave that that Abraham had obtained. And Jacob wanted to be taken back and buried. Well, word came that Jacob was ill, and this was evidently his final illness. Joseph brought his sons Ephraim and Manasseh down to visit. And as the story comes in, Jacob, we're told, strengthened himself, verse 2, and sat upon the bed. He was excited to see them coming. He was, by this time, he was very elderly. His eyesight was pretty well gone. Joseph brought the boys in and brought them here before his father, and he lined them up in such a way, he knew his dad couldn't see. And he was going to lay hands on them and set them apart for a blessing. So he lined it up where Manasseh, the oldest son, would be there for the right hand, and Ephraim, the younger son, would be there for the left hand, and that he would lay his hands on them. Well, he brought them in, and Jacob crossed his hands, laid his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. Well, as Joseph began to notice what was going on, he stopped him and said, "Wait a minute, Dad, you're mixed up here. This is Ephraim and this is Manasseh. Here, switch your hands over." His dad said, "No, I know it. I know it. He, Manasseh, shall truly become a nation, and he shall be great." This is here in verse 19. "The younger brother shall be greater than he. His seed shall become a multitude of nations." You know, for a period of clearly 100 years from the fall of Napoleon in 1814 until the time of World War I, the British Empire absolutely stood without peer, without challenge in the world. We talk about one superpower. Well, they were it. The British Navy completely ruled the seas. The British flag came to fly over 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. 1/4 of the people on the Earth were British subjects. And even in the aftermath of World